fill us all things, treasure of good things, and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from all impurity and save our souls, O good one. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. We've cut some serious time out of our time together tonight, so I'm going to have to rush through some things. But nonetheless, hopefully what we have time to do is profitable. Well, as most of you probably already know, this Sunday, which is coming up upon us, is the first Sunday after the great feast of Pentecost. And accordingly, as has been established in the tradition of the church, we will be celebrating the great feast of All Saints. Now, a little bit of historical background. We may have covered this last year. I can't remember whether I spoke to you on All Saints last year or not, but nonetheless, we'll go over some of the history first before we proceed on to other things. Historically speaking, at least, the Feast of All Saints traces its beginnings back to about the 9th century, during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI the Wise. Now, Leo's first wife, who was named Theophano, was a very devout woman, so devout, in fact, that Leo, rightly, as the church is determined, considered her to be a saint even before she had reposed. And accordingly, because of this belief, when she did eventually repose, Emperor Leo went to the patriarch, saying that he had the intention of building a church dedicated to her. So a church, let's say, to Saint Theophano, even though she hadn't been canonized yet. However, when he went to the patriarch and brought up this matter, the patriarch dissuaded him from doing so, quite rightly suggesting that more time should be allowed to pass before they took such a step, i.e. that of building a church in her honor, in order to sort of be certain of things, because God, we know, sort of reveals things with time. And we want to be certain when we proceed to sort of such serious things as agiocatatexi, when we put someone in the Synaxarion. Leo, when he had this discussion with the patriarch, submitted quite quickly to what the patriarch suggested, that he not proceed to build a church in honor of his wife, but decided that what he would do instead was build a church dedicated to all the saints, thinking that at least in this way, if she were indeed truly amongst the choir of saints, by dedicating a church to all saints, she would be appropriately honored in this way. Because, of course, if we're reverencing all the saints and she happens to be among the saints, then she's being honored. So Leo thought this was an appropriate way around the issue. Now, after this episode with the Emperor Leo, the church, in her wisdom, embraced this idea of celebrating the saints with a feast day as a choir, all together at once, and determined that every year on the first Sunday after Pentecost, a feast of all saints should be celebrated. So why, however, did the church embrace this idea? According to the Synaxarion, we know the church did so for 3 basic reasons. The first is connected with the Feast of Pentecost itself. The saints, as we know, are living temples of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit resides within them as a result of their purity of heart. And as they show by the height of their virtue and the miracles they perform, all these bear witness to the fact that the Spirit of God resides with them. Therefore, the saints are evidence that Pentecost has really occurred, that the Holy Spirit indeed has descended, and that it resides with the church. So the celebration of all saints, in other words, works in tandem with the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of All Saints being the proof that the first indeed occurred. The second reason that the church has embraced such a celebration, the celebration of all saints, was because it knew that many saints had passed the course of their earthly lives completely unknown to anyone. And by having a Feast of All Saints, this was a way of honoring even those saints who had passed their lives unknown to others. And third, the third reason as to why the church embraced this idea of celebrating all the saints together, like the Feast of the Three Hierarchs, the Feast of All Saints is an opportunity to show forth the unity of faith, since the whole chorus of diverse saints brings together people of every age group, of every gender, from every time and from every place, all having been nurtured with the same faith and within the one church. And so it bears witness to the unity of the faith. Now, beyond those things that we've just spoken of, the Feast of All Saints is greatly important for yet another reason. It marks the end of the period of the church year, which is known as the Pentecostarian, which began on Pascha, if you think back. And accordingly, bearing witness to the fact that we've changed ecclesiastical seasons, you'll notice that the readings appointed to be read at Divine Liturgy are changing. Now, beginning with Pascha, the Gospel readings were taken from where? We remember the Gospel according to St. John. Well, the Epistle or the Apostolic readings came from the book of Acts. And you'll remember the last time we were together, we spoke, or a couple times maybe, we spoke about the book of Acts. Today, however, or rather this coming Sunday, things switch. The Gospels will now begin to come from St. Matthew, and the epistles or the apostolic reading will start to come from the letters of St. Paul. And of course, as we have said many times now, it is the epistles that we're going to be focusing on in our time together over the next year. Now, the epistle that we'll be reading this coming Sunday, the Sunday of All Saints, comes from St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, which most of you probably already know, but we'll run through some basic facts about it because we don't actually encounter it that often in liturgical readings. It's the last of St. Paul's writings included in the New Testament. And in fact, it's known as the most beautifully written of all of St. Paul's writings, both in terms of the types of phrases it uses and in terms of the level of Greek. The level of Greek is much higher than most of St. Paul's. And this is what has actually caused many of the Protestant denominations to sort of call into question the authorship of the Epistle to the Hebrews. They start to say, oh, well, because it doesn't resemble any of St. Paul's other writings, therefore it can't actually belong to St. Paul. So if you look in most of the Protestant Bibles, it will just say letter to the Hebrews, not the Apostle Paul's letter to the Hebrews. And this, of course, we know is erroneous because we who have tradition can look back through the tradition and understand that this epistle actually does trace its roots back to the pen of the Apostle Paul himself. So it is the Apostle Paul's letter to the Hebrews, contrary to what you may hear, especially within Protestant circles. Now, as its name at least vaguely suggests, the letter to the Hebrews is addressed to a community of Jews who, following the true intention of their religion, became Christians, embraced the Christian faith, embraced Christ. These Jewish converts, however, were being extremely harshly treated by the scribes and the Pharisees and their followers on account of their conversion. This is probably no surprise to us, having seen even in the book of Acts that we've read in the last few weeks, how the Jews responded to the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter and their missionary endeavors. So the Pharisees and scribes and their followers were really displeased with this community that had converted to Christianity. And some of the people of this community that St. Paul writes to, were even arriving at the point of beginning to question if they'd made the right decision, not really because they distrusted the faith that they'd embraced, but rather the treatment they were receiving was so harsh it was causing them to second guess what had happened. St. Paul then takes a look at this situation and he sees how beaten down this community of Jewish converts was becoming. And being a good pastor, the good pastor that he is, he writes them and encourages them. He writes them this letter intended to encourage them. And he does so by two means in particular. First, talking broadly about the Epistle to the Hebrews, he uses it as an opportunity to remind them of the superiority of Christianity when it's compared to the Jewish religion. We find, for example, within the epistles, a number of beautiful arguments sort of laid out. The most common one probably that people recognize is the one where he compares the continual offering of base animal sacrifices prescribed by the Mosaic law to the spiritual sacrifice of Christ. And he draws this comparison over and over again in order to demonstrate the spiritual superiority of Christianity. So that's the first thing he tries to do, to remind them that they've indeed turned towards the fulfillment of the Jewish faith, and indeed a faith superior to what they were living as Jews. And second, he provides them with examples, particular examples, of trial and endurance, drawing out from the Old Testament in particular, which are examples they'd be familiar with, in order to help them to have a sense of how to deal with the situation they were in themselves, and to give them courage to face the trials which they're being faced with. And so if we look at the reading which is appointed to be read today, and I think we'll read it here just in 1 second so we have it before our eyes, the place of the reading which is appointed to be read on Sunday is fairly obvious. It's a piece of the 11th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, which is commonly called St. Paul's hymn in praise of faith. In Corinthians, we have the hymn to love. This piece of writing from St. Paul is often called the hymn in praise of faith. And so let's read it now together just to get a sense of what St. Paul is talking about before we begin to look at how it's engaged by the Holy Fathers. So the reading that you'll read this Sunday, you'll hear read in church, is taken from the 11th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, beginning at in the 32nd verse and going to chapter 12, verse 2. "And what more shall I say?" he writes. "For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions," he's of course speaking of Daniel, "quenched the violence of fire," speaking of the 3 children, "escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, others tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might attain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of which the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and in caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily ensnare us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. And so that's the epistle reading for this coming Sunday. So what does this reading and its greater context within the 11th chapter of St. Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, what does it speak of principally? Primarily, it's concerned with how the great virtue of faith affects the lives of Christians practically, and particularly how it serves us, indeed how it is essential in times of difficulty. Now, before we proceed on much further, I think we must ask ourselves a very basic question that we can't always assume the answer to. And that question is, what is faith exactly? St. Paul answers this question for us beautifully at the beginning of chapter 11, just before our reading begins. Faith, as probably most of you have heard this line because it's so beautiful, it's repeated many times over and over again in patristic literature and elsewhere. Faith, St. Paul writes, is the substance or the certainty of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. Then he gives a long series of examples to begin to flush out this definition. By faith, he says, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, prepared an ark for the saving of his household. So it's this idea of a certainty in the things God has promised, an unshakable certainty in the things that God has promised. And then he uses these examples like Noah, Abraham, Sarah, in order to begin sort of giving examples of what he's talking about. So after this definition and the examples, today's passage begins, and it begins by explaining what it is that faith looks like, essentially in action, what it accomplishes, in other words. Many, it says, through faith have subdued kingdoms. Many have worked righteousness. Many have obtained promises. Many have stopped the mouths of lions. They've quenched fire. The weak have been made strong. The tortured have not accepted deliverance. In other words, there's been people who have suffered and had the opportunity to stop their suffering, by either caving in or some other means, and they've chosen to continue. Others have suffered trial, mockings, scourgings, chains, imprisonment. Some sojourned in deserts, mountains, and caves, like the ascetics to some extent. They've chosen to live apart from the world and give up the things of the world for the sake of God. So through faith, they did all these things. Now, fundamentally, looking at this big list of things, these accomplishments of faith, we might call it, St. Chrysostom, who most of you know, I've said this a few times now, who according to our tradition is the mouth of Paul, just as Paul is the mouth of Christ. This is how authoritative the writings of Chrysostom are, St. John Chrysostom are, when it comes to the interpretation of St. Paul. St. Chrysostom, when he sees this big list, says that essentially it boils down to two fundamental things. There are two basic moral products of faith. There are two ways that the virtue of faith manifests itself in how we act. On the one hand, St. Chrysostom says, faith helps us to accomplish great things. And indeed, brothers and sisters, there is no greater thing than the tearing up of the passions and learning, as the reading we have just said, learning to do works of righteousness, or how to live righteously. Now, how does faith, the virtue of faith, help us to do this? I would suggest that it is our faith in the existence of paradise and the very promise of salvation, things which are of course yet unseen to us, which cause us and prompt us to struggle to live the commandments of Christ. Without belief or without faith in the existence of paradise, for example, all that we have in this, all that we have is this life, and there is therefore no real incentive for us to deprive ourselves of anything in the here and now at all. If now is all we have, brothers and sisters, then we should just live for now. This is perhaps the mentality we might take. But because we have faith, faith in paradise, faith in salvation, we push ourselves to lay aside the things of this life that we might eventually come to embrace greater things. So faith serves to help us accomplish great things, and great things particularly when it comes to living the life of the commandments. This belief, this faith in paradise and salvation helps us to free ourselves from baser things we might otherwise get attached to. This is the first thing St. Chrysostom says. Now, St. Chrysostom also raises a second achievement of faith, or a moral byproduct, we might say, of faith. It also serves, he says, to help us endure great things. Now, we could look here to the example of the martyrs, who endure all manner of suffering in this life because of the belief that they will inherit the heavenly kingdom. But I think we would do well here to look at something a little more close to home, something perhaps a little more immediately pertinent to us in our lives, who don't face martyrdom every day. Our Lord, we know, tells us that if someone slaps our cheek, we should not fight back, but instead we should offer them our other cheek as well, that it too might be slapped. In other words, we should bear, or we should suffer, if you will, insults. We should suffer insults. Here again, I would suggest that it is the belief in God's promises that make us able to endure such things. Without faith in paradise, without a healthy faith in paradise, the temptation is to settle all wrongs in the here and now. For to faithless minds, there is no higher court of appeal and no possible reason for enduring the wrong. If all that we have is the here and now, then there's no point in letting ourselves be put down in this life. We need to exalt ourselves as much as possible in this life. But because we have faith, because we believe that there's something beyond this life, we're able to endure things for the sake of the greater good. So according to Chrysostom then, St. Paul tells the Jewish converts, and he tells us as well, that if we are to be successful in running the Christian race, that race which is set before us that he refers to, especially in the midst of trials, we absolutely must cultivate a strong faith that will help us to endure. Once he comes to the end of this list now that we've just read, St. Paul then begins to set forth motivations for his readers, and again, indeed for us, to labor to attain this faith. And how does he do this? He says that these achievements, the things that he's listed in this long list of Old Testament achievements of faith, in and of themselves, are not really anything. They're sort of nothing. All these, he writes, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. And this is the important part. God having provided something better for us. What they did through faith, St. Chrysostom says, was a little bit like moving furniture around within the palace. But we, however, have the opportunity to become familiar with the King himself through faith. They may have stopped armies, they may have quenched fires, but we have the opportunity to become partakers of the divine nature if we embrace faith and the moral implications that come from it. Today's epistle then concludes with a very beautiful passage, which most of us have probably heard read over and over again, which I think quite precisely ties us back to the theme of the whole feast that we're going to be celebrating on Sunday. St. Paul tells these Jewish converts at the end, since we are surrounded with so great a cloud of witnesses, since we see so many examples of people who lived faith in its essence, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Like them, in other words, let us use our faith to overcome and endure, to look past the things of this life which trap us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sits down at the right hand of the Father. That is, keeping the example of Christ in our mind, who endured all manner of evils for the sake of the joy of human salvation. Now, this passage also applies very directly to us, especially when we think about celebrating the Feast of All Saints. Because once we put ourselves spiritually in the midst of that feast, we too are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses who have run the road of faith set before them and stand up as examples for us. Let us look then, brothers and sisters, to these and be encouraged to struggle and to endure all for the sake of the pearl of great price, which is, of course, union with God himself.